2020. A very, very sad day for the United States. But right now with me is Betty Keneally, who was at Pearl Harbor during those traumatic times. But listening to FDR on his Day of Infamy speech reminds a little story that I'd like to pass on, if I may. When he began to write his speech, he looked for the speech writers, and they were not there. They couldn't be found. So he called Grace Tully, his secretary, and asked her to come in, and he dictated the Day of Infamy speech that he was going to give to Congress the next day. However, the original was a date that will live in history. When he reread his comments, he found out that date of infamy was much better. Betty, what was your traumatic experience at Pearl Harbor? You were a little 9-year-old girl at the time.
Yes.
What do you remember about that day?
I remember almost everything because it was very traumatic and, you know, it sticks in your memory forever, really. Would you like me to tell you what happened?
I would love for you to tell me.
Okay, well, what happened was I was the oldest of 5 children, and my mother had a new baby. And what she would do was on Sunday, she would get the baby ready for church, get us ready first. And when she was getting the baby ready, my father would take us to the airport to watch the planes take off. We loved to do that. They had little, it was they called it John Rogers Airport, but that's the Honolulu International Airport now. But they had mainly, you know, small planes that would take off. So we did that. We went to watch the planes take off while she got the baby ready, and then we had to leave because it was time to go to church. We used to go to church at the Block Arena, which was right outside of Pearl Harbor Gate. And it was a big amphitheater where they had all the services. So to our reluctance, we had to go. We had to go back and get ready for the rest of, get the rest of the people to go to church. So we went back to our housing, which was right near Hickam Field. In fact, my back door was Hickam Field, really. And my father went up to shave, and suddenly there was an awful lot of racket and booming and everything. And we thought at first it was a practice, which they did quite often on Sundays. But then my father looked out the window and saw the small planes with the red suns, and he knew immediately that we were being bombed by the Japanese. Because I guess there was a lot of talk. The Japanese wanted the Hawaiian Islands. There was much talk about that, and people were very aware of that. So he recognized it right away that we were being bombed. And his first thought was to get us out of there because he was afraid they were going to bomb the housing. So he gathered us all together very quickly, and we went out to go to our car, and people were standing in the street looking at the bombing. And he said, "Get in the house, get out the danger." And one pilot was lost, and I'll never forget his face. He got down real low in the street, and you could see his face. He was just in a little one-pilot plane, you know. But they didn't do any bombing in the housing because their aim was to go to the ships. They did come back later and machine gun the housing, but we were gone by then. My father took us to friends about 30 minutes away. We woke them up, and of course they were shocked, and we stayed there with them. But what they did was they called all the men back into Pearl Harbor to help rescue the people out of the ships. My father was a sheet metal worker, so he had to do that, and they were gone for about 3 days. We didn't hear from them. But my father said it was very hard at first because the attack came in 2 waves, and you really couldn't do anything until the second raid was over with. But he did work very hard on rescuing men from different ships.
Betty, your father, was he in the Navy?
No,
why were you there? You know.
Well, he worked for the Navy.
Okay.
He had gone to the Navy to work in Pearl Harbor on a 2-year contract. He was a sheet metal worker. And it was just a 2-year contract. But of course, the war changed all that because he was frozen to his job. And we
did you evacuate Hawaii, or did you stay there?
No, because we were civilians. We could do what we wanted to do. And we could stay. All military dependents had to leave unless the women had an essential job. but we did not have to go. My mother was going to go, and then she decided not to break us up because she said she didn't know how long the war would last, you know, how long we'd be separated, and also could we safely make it to San Francisco without being torpedoed.
Right.
So she decided not to leave, and so we stayed, and we were allowed to stay. That was our prerogative. And my parents are buried there. They never left because of the war, and my father stayed in his job. And then after the war, my father had fireman background, and after the war, they turned the fire department over to the civilians from the Marine Corps. And my father became the first fire chief of the 14th Naval District. In fact, there's a museum there at Pearl Harbor honoring him and a monument and so on.
Did you have an occasion or an opportunity to watch the bombing of the battleships in the
As we
road?
left, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, the Arizona burned for days. We returned to our house after a few days, and it was still burning.
That's what I was going to ask
And they
you.
were very worried because we had, I guess, fuel storage tanks on the side of Pearl Harbor.
Was that over
that
at
they
Ford
would hit
Island?
those, yes, but they didn't. And that would have caused, you know, a very serious problem. And of course, they machine gunned the highways too, but we were quick enough to miss that. My father thought so quick we got going before it happened. But we were confined. We didn't hear from him for 3 days, as I said, so we were confined at the house. And there were rumors of paratroopers landing, that our water was poisoned, you know. And of course, we immediately had blackout, and we also immediately were put under martial law.
So you could not go out at night?
No, after 6
Didn't
o'clock.
dare to go
After
out at
6
night.
o'clock, you could not be on the streets. And I don't think any U.S. territory has ever been put under martial law except Hawaii.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure, but I think that's the case, you know.
Some of the reports that I have read that our own civilians or our own people were shot
Oh,
because
yes.
they were out at night. They shouldn't have been.
Yes, because people were, they were very nervous. And you can imagine everybody was very scared that something was going to happen. And if you didn't answer a sentry correctly when you went somewhere, they were shot, yes. This happened quite a bit.
Well,
And
now, a day or 2 or 3 or 4 after Pearl Harbor, was food hard to come by? Was there any?
I don't know. Being a child, I didn't pay a lot of attention. We stayed with friends, and I guess they provided things, but the schools were closed.
Schools were
And then we were switched around to different schools because some of the schools were used as hospitals. So I went to a different school, and what they did was you would go either in the morning from 7 to noon or from noon to 5. They divided it up, you know, between the children. And we didn't have trouble with food as time went by. Gas was always very hard to get. And,
gasoline.
Yeah, gasoline,
yeah.
yes. And I don't know what they did with the food. I should know that, but, you know, being a child, I didn't pay. I didn't pay attention to it, so I didn't know. But what they did too was they had us mark our money with Hawaii, our paper money. We had to turn all our regular money in, and our paper money was marked Hawaii in case we had an invasion, because they were afraid, I guess, the Japanese would use it, and so.
I don't think that was ever brought out.
No, so there was accumulated. If you were an individual, I think you could only have $200 or $300 in cash, and a business could only have $500. And that's how you used your money during the war. And then after the war, of course, they asked you to turn it back in.
Yeah.
But we had everything stamped.
You didn't keep anything as a souvenir, or Mom and Dad didn't?
No, no. And of course, we were very worried, you know, we'd be invaded. And that worry continued until the Battle of Midway.
Now, you were evacuated. Your dad Mom took you to a certain location. How long were you there before you went back to your house?
About 3 or 4 days.
3 or 4 days?
Yes.
Your house was not damaged whatsoever?
No, it was not. But some of the houses were machine gun. And in fact, they still in Hickam have buildings where there are machine gun marks on them.
So they've
kept them, yes.
Is that right?
We were so very close to Hickam, see. We were right there, practically on top of it, so that was that way.
but as a 9-year-old girl, this is stuck with you all these years.
Oh, yes, it was very scary. We were issued gas masks. We had to carry gas masks. And, of course, the blackout we were very well aware of.
Yeah.
And children sort of acclimate to things, I guess, you know, but we were under a war condition the whole time. And as I said, we were very worried because of invasion, and the only thing that saved that was we won the Battle of Midway.
Yeah.
And I think we destroyed the ships that brought the planes that bombed Pearl Harbor at the battle.
Yeah.
But we had because we were in we were treated like military. So we were in military housing, and
You were treated like military. In what way?
We had all the privileges of the commissary and PX,
you did have
and we lived in the housing, yes. Just as if my father was in the military. And they built, you know, air raid shelters for us, and we had a place in the mountains to go if we were invaded. I don't know if that would do any good, but my mother had things packed to go in case we were. But I don't, you know, women and children, I don't think we could have hid very long.
No.
I don't think that would have happened. But as it happened, nothing happened. Everything turned out fine, so we didn't have that worry. But that was a constant worry. And sometimes we'd have air raids during the night. We never were bombed again, but we'd have a plane got in the wrong way or something, didn't take up on the radar.
Yeah.
My mother would wake us up and get us into the air raid shelter. That was scary.
Would go off?
Pardon me?
Would the sirens go off?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
So the populace there was still a little jumpy.
Oh, yes.
Maybe, 2 or 3 months after the
Yes,
Pearl
almost
Harbor?
until the Battle of Midway, I would say things were very,
Midway
very
was
scary.
In June of
yes. And then, of
40.
course, they calmed down a little bit.
Yeah.
But always through Hawaii, we had all the troops passing through and everything. My parents joined a club that was started by a man who lost his son in the war. And they had a convalescent hospital near us. And we would have 3 or 4 of the men for dinner every week. We got to meet a lot of nice young men. But if you weren't wounded too badly, you'd go to Hawaii and recover and then go back into the Pacific into the fighting.
Just a small aside, did you meet your husband?
I met him in Hawaii. He was in the Navy.
He was in the Navy.
Yes, and I played the organ for the Navy chaplains when I was in college to make some money. And a friend of his was getting married. And so his friend said, "Why don't you come down and meet the organist?" And as my husband said, he wasn't too interested in meeting an organist. But he went down, and I was a senior in college, and I met him. And a year later, we were married.
Did you go to the University of Hawaii?
I went to the University of Hawaii, yes.
And you graduated with a degree in?
I have a bachelor's degree in communication.
Wonderful. Well, Betty, it's been a joy chatting with you and reminiscing, if you will.
Thank you.
I really shouldn't say it's a joy, but it was certainly a pleasure to me to have you here with us and to recount some of what you've experienced as a young lady at 9 years old. So thank you for coming on board.
Thank you very much.
And next we're going to have a little roll-in. May we have that, please?
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. For it was on this date, a Sunday morning at 8 a.m., when hundreds of Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor and the island of Oahu, Hawaii. This devastating surprise attack killed 2,403 Americans and wounded over 1,000. There were 2 waves to the attack, which was carried out by 353 Imperial Japanese fighter planes, bombers, and torpedo planes. 8 U.S. naval battleships were damaged. 4 were sunk. All but the Arizona were later raised. The USS Arizona Memorial commemorates the attack. This memorial is built over the sunken wreckage of the Arizona, the final resting place for many of the 1,177 crewmen killed. Designed by Honolulu architect Alfred Priest, the memorial was built in 1962. This structure is on top of, but not touching, the sunken battleship. She rests where she fell, just off the coast of Ford Island. Some 75 years later, oil still oozes from the ship, anywhere from 2 to 9 quarts daily. Although the exact amount cannot be determined, it is estimated that over 500,000 gallons of bunker C fuel still remains within the Arizona's hull. The USS Arizona Memorial honors the memory of its crew, as well as all the other service members and civilians who died during the attack.
Well, at the time, my father was the engineering officer on the USS Maryland, which was stationed in Pearl Harbor. It was a battleship. It was right next to the Arizona, and the Arizona, of course, was capsized. We went into a Sunday afternoon. We went for our usual Sunday afternoon drive, went into a filling station that was run by a friend of my mother's, and I just remember this vividly all these years later. He said, "Jane, where did you say Bob was stationed?" And she said, he's on the Maryland at Pearl Harbor. And he said, "Jane, go home and turn on your radio. Pearl Harbor's been attacked by the Japanese." So we went home and turned on the radio, and indeed we heard that. But of course, that was before mass communication. And it was, I can't remember, either New Year's Eve or New Year's Day before we heard that my father was safe. And the chaplain on the ship notified each family separately. There was no mass communication, and by the time he got up to the senior officers, it was the end of that month. And so then the ship came into Seattle, and we went there, and we were there for a while, and then my father was transferred to building ships, and so we came back to the East Coast. And that's it.
Oh, we're back again. We just heard a very interesting story from Betty Keneally and also Carolyn Posey. And now my next guest is Tom Williams. And good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Bob.
We have heard in the past how the two happened to be in Pearl Harbor. How did you happen to be? Were you in the military?
No, I was in military academy. I was a cadet.
In Hawaii?
And no, in Virginia.
Uh-huh.
And that night, we'd played around during the afternoon, the cadets, Sunday is a day off and so on. And so it came 7 o'clock, I went back to my room for study hall, and my roommate had the radio on. And I said, you better turn that off or we'll get gigged. And he said, don't you know what happened? No. And he said, they've bombed Pearl Harbor. And I said, like probably a million other people, where is Pearl Harbor? And he didn't know either, but we'd been bombed. So quite obviously we listened to the radio, and we did not get gigged for doing so.
Yeah.
The next morning, a number of the faculty officers were nice enough to bring their radios into the classrooms. And so I heard the original presentation of President Roosevelt did, the day that will live in infamy and so on. Mm-hmm. It was kind of interesting too. There were a number of the cadets there up to that point that were kind of goofing off. They weren't really soldiering the way they should have. It was amazing. By the following morning, everybody was very, very much involved, and we all knew at that point that we were going to be in military service.
A great transformation.
Yeah. I graduated that following June, that was June 42, and then went into the University of Pennsylvania, but I also joined the ROTC at Penn. I had 1 semester, and I was called up to active duty.
What school were you attending when you were a cadet?
Fort Union Military
Fort Union,
Academy.
okay.
It's about 125 miles south of here, as you probably know. Yeah.
You were not commissioned when you graduated from Fort Union.
I was not. I only had 2 years there as a cadet.
I see.
And also, at that point, I think I would have been too young. I was only 18.
Well, this Fort Union at that time, was that equivalent to a high school?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
now I understand.
And then when I went into the Army, having been to the academy, it was duck soup to get a commission.
Sure.
I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, the infantry school, and was a second lieutenant when I was 20. And the day that I was 21, I had orders for the Pacific.
And where did you go?
I was ultimately to Japan. I went into Yokohama. But what happened was we were planning to go, or scheduled to go, to the Philippines. But when I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, they dropped the A-bombs. The war was suddenly over, and everybody thought we'd go back to the States, but no such luck. But we did turn and did not go to the Philippines. We went on into Yokohama.
I recall making a visit out to the Udvar Hazy Museum, and I looked up, I stood underneath the Enola Gay, and I looked up and I just said one little phrase. It just said, thank you, because I too was on orders to go to the Pacific, and I assumed we'd wind up in Japan.
Yeah.
But the perennial question that you mentioned, when Pearl Harbor existed or happened, my father had taken me to a movie in Philadelphia. And when I came out of the movie, we had the children hawking extra, extra, read all about it. And I turned to my father and I said, Pearl Harbor, where is that? He said, I don't know, I had no idea. Yeah. And this was the case with just about everybody in the United States.
I agree, yeah.
Yeah, it was, I don't say it was a secret, it just wasn't publicized.
If they had said Hawaii, I would have been fine.
Yeah.
But Pearl Harbor,
Harbor.
no.
Right.
I didn't know anything about it.
Do you feel that Pearl Harbor in any small way affected your career?
Oh, there's no question about it. Oh, absolutely. Also, though I was the son of a reserve officer who had been recalled, he was in World War I, and then he got recalled for World War II.
He was recalled.
Before Pearl Harbor. And he began telling me that we were going to be in a war, which is one reason he sent me to the academy. And so that's the way it worked out. I had a civilian career all planned, but I never got to it because what happened was when the war was finally over and I came back out of Japan, having been there for a year in occupation duty, I went back to the University of Pennsylvania, and 3 weeks after I graduated from Penn, the Korean War started. And I had a reserve commission, and so I just stayed in the Army for about the next 600 years.
You wound up right after Pearl Harbor and things had settled down. You wound up in Southeast Asia?
That was later on, yeah.
Where was this in Southeast Asia?
Well, first of all, there was the Korean War, so we did that. Then I went into Thailand. We were going to go into Laos and do the same thing in Laos that we were beginning to do in Vietnam.
Were you a member of the intelligence
Yes, I was.
community?
Yes, I was.
Can you talk about it
No.
to this day?
I honestly don't know, Bob. I've never inquired. What I'm going to say is certainly not classified. We were involved with trying to help the Lao people out, just as they were trying to help the Vietnamese people. And we accumulated information about enemy forces, the communist forces. And then I was an order of battle officer, and for those that don't know about order of battle, that's sort of getting all sorts of things about the enemy and then being able to present it to friendly commanders so they know what they're getting into.
That's right.
You cannot go into a battle without knowing pretty well what you're going to what's going to happen.
But you were not a member of the OSS or the CIA at that time?
No, I did not. I just stayed in the Army.
Okay.
And, but it was a fascinating time. I was very fortunate. I loved what I did, and I've certainly been very grateful to everything I've had.
What lasting memories of Pearl Harbor do you still have today?
How awful it was, the damage that was done, and we were talking a minute ago about the oil leaking from the ships that were sunk, and it's still coming up drop by drop. And this is 75 years later. It's amazing that they would be still getting the oil.
And the little bulletin that we had still said that there's 500,000 gallons of oil still remaining in the Arizona.
I can hardly conceive of that much oil.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it really
So
is.
we can predict, if you will, 100 years from now, it'll still have that bubble
Could be.
going up.
Yeah.
I remember when I was at the Arizona, I looked down, I could see this little bubble coming up, and I kind of solemnly looked down, and 1,177 souls are still in that graveyard.
Yeah. You know, it's a very moving situation, and I'm sure if you've been there once, you'll never forget it.
One little memory, not of Pearl Harbor itself, but of Japan. When I went over in the Army of Occupation, I was surprised at how friendly the Japanese were.
Yeah, I had the same experience.
I thought sure there would be animosity, but it was not there.
No, I would agree with that. I think that basically they were so thankful for the war to be over, and they weren't getting bombed anymore.
Amen.
And we were treating them fairly decently, which they had not realized would happen. And I think they just simply took advantage of it and returned the favor, as it were, and they were friendly.
And Tom, with those intelligent remarks, I'm going to thank you very much for appearing on the show. You certainly added a lot, and I again thank you.
You very much, Bob. It was a pleasure.
And I hope our viewer, I should say, enjoyed the program. I do have some announcements, if I may.